to our Privasec event Joins with BSI. My name is Charmaine Tan. I'm the Chief Growth Officer at Privasec, and very excited here to have an expert panel here with us. We have actually set aside time to address really key critical questions about your right fit for risk assurance pathways. So for those who are wondering what is that all about, we will find out very soon. Okay, just to highlight that this session is being recorded. And if you guys have any questions along the way, feel free to type them in the chat box on the right side, and we will endeavor to address as many questions as possible during this session. Now, as we have a lot of grounds to cover today, we're just gonna dive right into today's session. I have with me our panel moderator, John Rihana, and he's our client services lead at Privasec, and he will be introducing the rest of the panelists to us, as well as providing a bit of background about who Privasec is and also BSI. So over to you, John. Enjoy the rest of the session, everybody.
Thank you very much, Charmaine. So as Charmaine mentioned, I liaise with clients on a regular basis for Privasec. So a bit of background for everybody that doesn't know who we are. We are a multinational cybersecurity company that focuses on three really key areas. So one of the areas, which is what we're going to be discussing today, is the GRC side of the business, which is the governance, risk and compliance. We also have a growing and very strong ethical hacking team, and we do a lot around drone security as well, which is really on that bleeding edge. So I've got two of our consultants with me. I've got Romain, who's the managing director and founder of Privasec. So he's got a great wealth of experience in both establishing and implementing information and security strategies. And 10 years ago, he was actually one of the first in Australia to achieve a service-based ISO 27101 certification. So very well known, understands the controls back and front. I'm sure he can provide a lot of insight. I've also got Vivienne Mutembwa on the call as well. So she's one of our senior consultants, does a lot of work with ISO 27701, as well as, I guess, the Australian government's ISM standards. So she works with public organizations and large multinational private organizations as well. So Dushyant is also joining us on the call from BSI. I mean, Dushyant, you'd probably do it much more justice talking about what BSI is and how you guys help organizations become more secure, I suppose.
Yep. Thanks, John. BSI is a 100-year-old organization, originally started as a standards writing body. So we are a not-for-profit Royal Charter company, primarily instrumental in Australia in not only writing the original 27001 standard, which came on the back of a British standard, but also auditing against the requirements of 27001, and also making sure all your regulatory requirements like ISM controls are covered within that.
Okay, so you're the general manager there, focusing on healthcare, finance, ICT as well. I think the first question is probably best to go to you. So for everybody that's joined us, can you give us the 10,000-foot high-level explanation of what right fit for risk is and how organizations can best approach this using something like an ISMS?
Yeah, certainly. Right fit for risk, and some people call it RFFR, is an approach to reduce complexity and align the level of risk for all the providers. Okay, and this RFFR started on the back of something called as an external system assurance framework that is aimed to make sure that either the providers or cloud security providers or any third-party employment systems are secure and meets the requirement as laid out by the department. And the approach is to make sure that 27001 is the backbone of the governance framework, and the idea is to ensure a whole of business approach to IT security, which focuses on people, focuses on processes, as well as IT infrastructure.
Right, so if we expand a little further into ISO 27001 for the people that don't know, and I think, Roman, you're the best person to sort of give the background on this. What is ISO 27001? How is it different from ISM, and how does it apply in this case?
Yeah, so at a high level, ISO 27001 has the title Information Security Management System, and it is exactly what the title says it is. It is a standard, to implement a system to manage information security. The wording is carefully chosen here because it's about implementing a system to manage, again, information security, meaning it's a governance standard. Whereas ISM is more like a library of control. It's a control-based standard. So both touch on similar areas of security, ISM with a lot more granularity, and ISM also applies in different ways to organization depending on how much I guess interaction or how to handle federal information in that case. So if you look at a high level, an ISMS is all about managing security using risks and control, and an ISM is one of several standards that could be assimilated to as a data bank or library of control. It just so happened that it is the one used by the federal government.
Right. So with ISM as the backbone or the controls used, the biggest question I had is, if I was running an organization that had to comply to this, like what are the controls that apply to me from a non-cybersecurity background? How do I know if I've selected the correct controls, and how do I know I haven't left anything out that's really essential? So I think, Vivienne, you'd be the best person to answer this with your experience. But how do you go about establishing this?
Thanks, John. So specifically for the right fit for risk, the recommendation would be that you ask the department to validate your list that you would have prepared prior to setting up your ISMS. And to do this, you would fill out a questionnaire and look at your operations to see which controls that you would select preliminary for your operations, complete the self-assessment, and then you can either do this by yourself or you can take on the services of an IRAP assessor, which is something that most organizations prefer to do.
So what are the pros and cons? So for me, deciding whether I use an IRAP assessor or do this on my own, what are the benefits of going with somebody who is an IRAP assessor? What are we potentially missing out on if we don't?
So I would say the benefits of going with an IRAP assessor would be that you'd significantly reduce the back and forth between yourself and the department. And also the department would have better assurance that your list is valid, because the IRAP assessor would have done the process with you as at the expected standard for the program. Usually what we see is that it takes about it costs less than $5,000 for this process to be undertaken by an IRAP assessor in most cases.
How much was that? Sorry, a bit unclear.
5,000.
Okay, so it's relatively a minor investment for such a big payoff. But once the organizations embark on this process and they do engage an IRAP assessor, what do they need to do on a monthly basis, on a quarterly basis? So how do they update the controls to make sure that they're constantly staying up to date? So what's the journey they have to go on after?
The manual itself is not prescriptive on how often you have to review your control implementation. However, because as you mentioned, the ISM is being regularly updated, our recommendation is that it depends on the risk profile of the organization. But if you do it on an annual basis, you'd be better off ensuring that you maintain the correct controls in terms of the renewal cycle of the ISM.
Right, and do they have to, so me as a service provider, would I have to, if I've already gone through this process in the past, so for example, last year I went about and compiled a list of controls that I think are applicable to my business, how often do the controls themselves change as opposed to my business changing, and what do I need to do to make sure I stay up to date on that front?
So it really depends on your organization. As I said, the risk profile of your organization, but the controls are evolving on a monthly basis. Sometimes there are significant changes, sometimes there are minor changes. But what's important here is to know that if you are reviewing them, you review them annually at the very least.
Okay, so we have to do it annually. Initially, we have to go through a process of aligning to those certifications on the controls that we've selected that we think are appropriate. So putting my business hat on for a second, how disruptive is this for an organization that isn't used to going through this process? So how long does it take to build an ISMS? What does that look like on a ground floor? What can we expect in terms of time, costs, and the rest of it? So Roman, I know you've done a ton of work in this space.
Yeah, so maybe I'll just take a quick step back. So for everybody's understanding, the process is to validate your list of controls with the department and then build the ISMS, right? Because you don't want to build the ISMS on a moving target. However, the good news is because an ISMS is a governance standard, chances are an organization may already be, out of just sheer good practice, doing some of these things already, ticking some of these boxes. So there is not a need. You can start your ISM designing your governance system almost ahead of having the controls validated. You just got to complete it without having the controls validated. So the way, for example, that you're gonna meet regularly to discuss risk or assess risk is not going to be dependent on which controls you have selected. So the good news for those who have a bit of a tighter deadline, excuse me, is that you can start a bit earlier. Now, time-wise, for an ISMS implementation, we typically allow between 3 to 6 months, and that's going to depend essentially on the complexity of an organization. So the more locations there are, the more complex the environment is from a process perspective, the longer it might take. But essentially, the bulk of the work, I guess what drives the difference between a 3 months or a 6 month implementation is going to be how much remediation work potentially an agency does have to do. Now, it's very important to understand that nobody's expecting that an organization ticks every single control perfectly in order to achieve certification to ISO 27001. One of the fundamental principles aside from risk is continuous improvement. So there's an understanding that you need to set up a baseline and then you will continuously improve in virtue of managing your risks. Right. So that being said, though, you do need to have as I said, a baseline of alignment with the ISM control, and that's what sometimes varies at time. So just to recap, when we do ISMSs like we do for the organizations from start to finish, it typically takes, it's about a 3 to 4 months effort. Sometimes that can extend to 6 months when organizations decide to take a bit of a step back to work on establishing the baseline of control before we proceed. And of course, we help them through the process. So we don't let them go to audit basically if we don't believe that they're not ready for it.
Okay, so it's 3 to 6 months. Does that apply for this particular case as well to align with RFFR? Or does the timeline change?
So the only variable there is the response side of the department. And as Vivienne highlighted, you can actually go to the department to validate your controls yourself. There's nothing that prevents you from doing that. However, you run the risk of sort of losing a bit of time going back and forth potentially with the assessing team at the Department of Employment. But that being said, because you can start the ISMS from the get-go, that time frame that I'm giving you, 3 to 6 months, is likely to apply here. With the caveat that if you're going to go on your own to the Department of Employment, you might just lose a bit of time potentially in just finalizing the risk of control there. So, and then I think you mentioned the cost, and we don't like to give cost out, right? Because it's always it depends kind of answer. But just to be helpful, I guess, to the audience, typical ISMS implementation, including, for example, the auditing cost, would range anywhere between sort of $60,000 to $100,000, right? Okay. That's sort of a very sort of ballpark that we're seeing.
And that's to go through an organization like ours that's done this process countless amounts of times.
As well as an organization like BSI, right? So when you look at this overall sort of end-to-end process, you're going to have the cost potentially of a consulting organization like ours helping you out. And that's where there's a lot of sort of effort required. You will also have the cost of a qualified auditor, in the case, auditing organizations such as BSI, and I think there's no large organization in BSI anyways, to actually see you through certification. So the certification process has 2 phases, a stage 1 phase and a stage 2 phase. And basically the stage 1 is making sure that your governance process is operating as it should, or is in place. And stage 2 is more the operational effectiveness. So stage 1, we look at the governance sort of continuous improvement life cycle based on risk. And stage 2, we look at the controls implementation. So BSI conducts both of these things, and we, Privasec, typically sit and guide the audit on behalf of our clients.
So in terms of practical tips, because I know we do this for a lot of organizations with different levels of cybersecurity maturity, right? So if I was an organization that hasn't gone through this process before, in terms of practical, what should I be looking for when I look at a partner to walk us through this process? What are the key things that stand out to us to say, yeah, these guys are the best position to guide us through this and minimize the disruption to our business?
So the reason why I'll try to keep the answer short because I tend to have long answers, but because I'm very good on this one. The reason why the right fit for risk came to be is because the previous pathways to accreditation, the Department of Employment's program required the full use of an IRAP assessor and it was quite lengthy. There are not a lot of IRAP assessors. It wasn't very flexible for smaller service providers. So based on that, right fit for risk came to be, and ISO is much more flexible, and is, as Dushyant mentioned, is a very old standard, so therefore it's been refined to fit most organizations. It basically depends on the size of an organization, but where you would start is by looking at what you already have in place. Chances are a lot of organizations, just out of sheer good practice, and everybody knows that security is the thing these days, right? Nobody can deny that. Chances are organization should start or already do something for security and should start taking stock of what they do for security. Sorry, I'm not sure if that answered the question.
Yeah, no, I do understand. So most organizations will probably be surprised at how far they've come from a baseline perspective, right? So what do they do after that point? So once they've assessed what sort of controls they already have in place, what they have as a baseline, should they then engage somebody like us or a third party, or what do they do in-house to get themselves ready?
So depending on the debate, it's all about whether or not you engage somebody like I said, yourself. Is all about budget. But I'll give you what you should do regardless of who does it, and then I'll talk about potentially engaging service of consultancy. You should list down your controls. If you've been on pathways to accreditation last year, you can leverage that off. And you already have. You're starting, on the winning foot there. Once you have your control listed, you should go down and start basically finding a business sponsor to get a management commitment. And none of this is about IT, right? So we're clear this is about information security. It extends beyond IT. IT is likely to be the bulk because it happens to hold a lot of the information we work with as organizations, but people and processes also matter a lot, right? And these days it's a lot easier to break into people than to break into system, right? Which is why social engineering is so prevalent. So find a business sponsor, identify your risks, to your organization, identify asset ownership. And when you think of asset, don't think about tangible asset, but also intangible asset. For example, knowledge, right? So if you're an employment provider with a lot of networking, for example, a lot of contacts, a lot of relationships that you build in the communities, this could be intangible assets that you rely on to do business. So identify your assets, assign ownership to these assets, and then methodically look at the potential business impacting security risk of the assets. So box ABC going down means nothing to nobody, right? So, but a service being down, for example, not being able to take new case loads or new cases for a week, that means something to everybody. So try and think of a risk in a business context. And I think when you answered in the previous question, when you asked about how we help organizations of different sizes or what sets us apart, it's really having that care factor and understanding that every organization is different. Our biggest implementation was literally of 147 countries for a huge multinational. It was a one-year project, and sometimes we do ISMSs for cloud SaaS providers or tech companies that have 20 staff, but with high value. So there's a lot of it all comes down to making sure that it's the risk assessment that you perform is going to be adequate for your business. The standard is a bit deceptive. If I'm a business person, I've never seen the standard. First, it's going to bore me to death because it's a standard, right? So chances are I will not read it in one go and I'll get a bit lost. But secondly, you'll realize that it's very not prescriptive, and that scares people because it doesn't tell you here's a list of boxes to tick. It tells you here's the art of risk management and here's the theory you should be following. So the way I explain it to people is that whilst the standard is very sort of non-prescriptive, which could be seen as a good thing, it also gives you plenty of opportunities to shoot yourself in the foot. So it's about being consistent, right? So you set a risk appetite for your organization, for the service provider, and then you follow that risk appetite throughout. So when you're looking at assessing your risk, try and identify maybe sort of 10 to 15 key risks that you can actually make a difference to. It's pointless coming out. You don't get extra point for a huge amount of risk. Then you basically look at your statement of applicability, what we commonly refer to as SOA, and that's like that library of controls that I've mentioned before. So in the case of ISO, you have an Annex A that lists high-level controls. But then in the case of right fit for risk, we map that against the ISM controls, hence the importance of making sure that you have your controls validated beforehand. So you're going to match your controls to your risks, and then you're going to see where you have gaps, basically, right? And you're going to go and sort of work. So all of that will form a long sort of action plan, if you will, and you're going to start remediating that plan. And that's part of the continuous life cycle. So what you're going to do to close out that loop is on a regular basis, you're going to measure how effective your controls are at effectively reducing your risk. And also you're going to perform an internal audit. If you have the staff, you perform an internal audit yourself. You have capacity and independency. Some people, actually most people use an organization like ours for independency reasons. And then once you've performed that sort of self check, if you will, you're going to go back to the executive sponsors and the business risk owners, and you say, Mr. Business, you told us you wanted the risk to be mitigated to that level, and we've checked, and turns out it's only there, right? Could be because business priorities have changed, money is running out for a variety of reasons, and then the business makes a decision on how they want to recalibrate their action plan or their mitigation plan to best suit their risk. So if you think of it like that, you realize that the business is responsible for deciding at which level of risk they want to set in order to operate. And they're responsible for constantly readjusting the course to best manage their risk. So the standard is very generous in the sense that it allows businesses to set the level of risk that they're happy with, provided it fits within the guideline of the Department of Employment, of course. So I'm not sure that it's a very long answer, but that's the step, right? So once you finish that and you've gone through that cycle, you then pick up the fund, call up BSI. If you're working with us, we'll do it for you, and then we plan the audit, and we actually pass through the audit. You have your certificate, which you can send to your account manager at the Department of Employment. When I say pick up the fund and call up BSI, it's a little bit the reality. The reality just due to resource shortages, it's actually the first thing we do, because when we do it for organization, and I guess that's one of the benefits of doing it using a consultancy, typically we are very sort of certain of the time and the effort it'll take us to be at a point where we can pass an audit. So usually the first thing we do is pick up the phone, because we know that BSI's got a lot of work, and it's you need to have a bit of a lead time to book the auditors in. So it's a good idea, if you're going to do it on your own, to try and book your audit as early as possible in the process, because the last thing you want to do is give them a call at the end and find out that there's nobody available for another 2-3 months.
And I can see Dushyant nodding there. So from your side of the fence now, as an auditor, yeah, it does. So what's your opinions on that approach, I suppose, from like an audit perspective when you're engaging with clients?
Yeah, from BSI's perspective, I think a lot of that is addressed by Romain and Vivienne already. But the key important thing that we do emphasize at the starting point is that this is one of the common questions we ask is, have you had a chance to make sure your SOA, which is Statement of Applicability, has been reviewed or approved by the department or not? That's an extremely important parameter, because we as BSI, we are doing an audit against the 27001 requirement, but those requirements are not sufficient. And 27001 Annex A, which has the library of controls, I think it's around 106, 110 controls, allows you to add more controls as required. Okay. The second important parameter is that we have to ensure that the providers are meeting their own regulatory requirements. And ISM controls and making sure that they are certified is a very, very important regulatory requirement as part of their deed. Hence, the first point of call is ensure you get your Statement of Applicability reviewed with all 500, 600 odd controls that are there. There is a mapping guide that the department has done. I think the latest version was done in May. That is, all the ISM controls are mapped to the 27001 controls, which means you exactly know what are the commonalities. And I think there's an 80 or 90% similarity, which makes your life easier as well. And that's the first step. Once that's being done, the process is fairly simple. You have stage 1, or you can also call it a document review, where our key focus is on your policies, procedures, what and how have you mapped out your governance structure. There are a couple of other important requirements. First being your management review. So what's the level of management commitment? Have you done any internal audit on your own, IT security framework? Whether you've done it or you've roped in a consulting company such as Privasec to be able to do it and make sure that your whatever you've implemented is robust for it to go through an external audit by BSI. So that's something that is what we look at stage one. At the end of every audit, we do provide a detailed report, and that report, I believe, needs to be submitted to the department as well, the stage one report. And if there is no feedback from them, if everything's works where all the controls are being laid out, we move to the process called as stage two, whereby we actually assess the effectiveness of the work that you've done. So you've got a framework. We would like to see how that has been implemented, whether it comes in terms of people's understanding of how it's being implemented, their training, their knowledge of what and where they come into play, how are the processes being implemented, what is it that you're checking to make sure who's doing it, and how is your IT infrastructure being laid out, and systematically we will go through each and every control. And within that, we will assess whether it maps out with what you've demonstrated in your SOA with some evidence. So, for example, you may have a control on cloud security, and you say that that's not applicable to us. Fair enough. We would look at the detailed justification in line with what you've done, and tick a box saying, okay, that makes sense. If there could be another control that you may have implemented, saying software development, and you aren't doing software development, fair enough. We will look at the justification, look at the activities that you are doing, and validate that that's right, and we'll cover that as part of our audit report for stage two. So that is kind of how BSI would go in and do the audit. And like any other audit, we will have to summarize everything that's being looked at, as well as the evidence that are being provided for in an audit report, which is again submitted to the provider, which I believe needs to be submitted again to the department as well for them to review, validate, ask any questions if they have. And if they do, we have worked in the past, and we are ready to work with the provider and the department if required to try and ensure that the report and the audit meets the requirement as outlined by the department. But just want to emphasize that this is not just your routine ISO 27001 audit. The idea is to make sure your 27001 framework is there, and all the related ISM controls are being reviewed and are being audited as part of the stage two audit. So it's a little more than your routine 27001 audit, is what I would like to emphasize.
I can see Vivienne nodding there. From a practicality perspective, what are, like, in light of what Dushyant's saying, what are some of the hints and tips you can provide, I suppose? What do you see our clients missing in a lot of cases, and what do you see them do really well and want to double down on?
I think, as Dushyant mentioned, it's really about understanding the links between the mapping of the ISM and the ISO 27001 controls, and really understanding that it's more about the control objectives and not necessarily meeting the exact wordings of the controls, because that's a focus that a lot of clients sometimes do take initially at the beginning. They focus on the wording of the controls and meeting the exact wording versus meeting the control objectives. And they find later on down the line that they are actually meeting the control objectives through alternate controls. And so that's sort of a tip that you can take right from the beginning.
Okay, so you're saying, just to clarify, we're talking about the intent there when we say control objective, right? So to look at the intent behind the control in conjunction with the wording, and not look at the wording only. And I think it's important to mention, just in what Dushyant said, that nobody's out there, and BSI is not out there to try and fail organization. If anything, everybody's sort of cheering up and hoping that the organization will be found to be compliant. So the attitude towards this is more trying to help an organization to improve and manage the security posture, and that's really where this is, that's the driver behind the whole project. So it's for people out there who might be thinking, Jesus and audits, let's duck in and hide. It's actually quite the opposite. And we see that when clients try and either sort of provide alternate fact, to be a bit US there, it usually makes the process a lot harder. So as you had mentioned, focusing on the intent, but also being very upfront with the level of risk that you have as an organization, because this will be, and I think the department highlighted that in one of their communication, that certification that BSI is going to provide you is not only going to, I guess, set you well and make you comply with the department's guideline or right fit for risk, but it's also going to provide a commercial advantage, right? So to your business, because ISO 27001, I'm sure many of you have seen that on a lot of websites these days, is becoming the baseline, the norm for any business that's operating with sensitive information.
That's really important. I think we haven't touched on that at all. We've just been looking at sort of being compliant, but I know a lot of the clients that we deal with get a lot of commercial value through, so for example, responding to tenders when they have that sort of certification. So what do you see as the big commercial windfall here? Like, how can these organizations take this, go through this process and use it to help build their business further? What do you commonly see?
Yeah, what we commonly see is, you're right, the drive is usually a contractual, people doing because they have to, or because they need to in order to attract more contract, because they're entering an enterprise market where they feel that it's just not getting these tickets to the bigger games unless, and that's one of the reasons why usually. Having BSI, BSI is, as I mentioned earlier, Dushyant, I think, mentioned how old BSI was, but didn't tell you that it's also the largest body on the planet to do this sort of thing. So having a certification with a very well-known certification body behind it is huge, and people should actually brag about it, right? So when I say brag, not necessarily in sort of a mean way, but making known in public that they have that certification, which gives a bit more confidence to their prospects that they're going to handle the information correctly, or at least that they know what they're doing, right? Back to what ISMS is about, is a governance. So you govern as per your risk appetite as a business sort of manager or executive. But at least I often say to people that being certified to ISO 27001 is giving the assurance to your market that you have a process for caring for risk and for security. Right? In that context, it's a little bit more stringent because, as Dushyant mentioned, the audit is also focusing on ISM controls as well. So these ISM controls guarantee that you can't just you can't abuse the system by, for example, having a very high tolerance to risk and not doing anything for security. So it prevents you from going to that extreme. But people should brag about it. There's no doubt. And the problem is, if you don't necessarily publish it proactively, competitors will. That's what we find.
Okay, those are good points. So Dushyant, I think it's best to go to you with this. Like, what sort of timelines are we working on here? How long do organizations have essentially to get this certification?
Yes, so the timelines are clearly stipulated by the department, depending on the size of the provider. So now the highest number of caseloads, people who have highest number of caseloads or more number of locations is where they have to go through the process to start with. I believe the next requirement is for a lot of organizations to complete their self-assessment as well as stage 1 statement of applicability by end of October. So that's one. There is a second set of deadline, which is April 2021. So these are some of the timelines that needs to be met on priority. That is purely to make sure that your documentation is being reviewed and the detailed report is being provided. Now, as far as the entire process is concerned, the stage 2 can vary for any organization between 4 weeks after the stage 1 is completed to as high as 4 months. It just depends on what's being identified. And the reason why that flexibility is provided is every provider is different. The findings are going to be different, and the implementation of some of these findings are also going to take the amount of time, which may vary from 4 weeks to 4 months. And the rationale being how many sites they have, how many people they have, what does the process look like, what's the maturity of the processes, what are the resources to help address some of the findings, if there are any, or are you leaning on external parties like your consultants such as Privasec to help do that for you? And that's why we give that flexibility. But most organizations on an average do stage 2 audit roughly close to 2 or 3 months time frame after stage 1's being completed. And once your auditor has submitted the detailed report, there is one important step that we have to do is to ensure that the same report is being independently reviewed by another set of auditor. Okay, and that's an important requirement that needs to be met. And after that process is completed, we issue a copy of the certificate, which outlines what's being reviewed, what are your locations that are being covered as part of the process, and what's the expiry date as well. And one thing that I would like to emphasize, and now that we've discussed everything, is other than the controls, it is extremely important that all your sites or all your locations that are there as part of your deed, as part of your contractual obligations, are included in your audit. That's an extremely important requirement, because even from an implementation perspective, so if you're looking to implement, ensure your implementation is not just on your head office, it's implemented across your organization, across every single location. Even if the controls are similar, it's a small site, small location where there are a couple of people working part-time only 2 days a week, does not matter. Ensure whatever relevant applicable controls, for example, physical security applies to every single location of yours. Ensure that's been implemented, because we will be looking at that as well.
Roman, you were saying?
I guess, yeah, no, on the time between stage 1 and stage 2, typically when with our clients, we take the stage 2 as soon as we take the stage 1, or as closely as possible. That's because we typically do not proceed with stage 1 if we know we're not going to be ready for stage 2. So it is not common that we have findings out of stage 1. There could be some, and when there are some, they're usually very light. Because we've sort of foreseen that a lot. So, you talk earlier about the benefit of sort of using a consultancy. I'm going to be tooting my own horn there for a second, but genuinely, every time I've seen organizations try, so you can do the process internally. It's not rocket science. Let's be honest. It's just it's like anything. If you do it for the first time, you're gonna learn from your mistakes and your errors, and you're gonna realize that it would have been probably cheaper and certainly a lot faster to engage external help. And that's what we're seeing. Is so many times we see people, we advise people at the beginning. Sometimes we just help them do a bit of an initial health check or assessment to help them set them on a path, and then we come back a bit later and have the time to say, you know what, can you just come in and finish it for us, because this is getting nowhere. So if you're going to do it internally, just make sure you dedicate somebody to it, because it will take, to achieve the timeframes that I've mentioned, it will take somebody dedicated to it. If you're going to, when people sort of do it sort of as an add-on to their BAU operations, we find that they easily take up to a year or 18 months to actually have it done.
Okay, cool. If any closing comments from any of you, final practical points that the attendees can use, or?
Yeah, I'd say don't delay. Dushyant mentioned the time frame. So if you're between 2,000 and 10,000, your stage 1 needs to be done in October, which is next month, right? So it's really important. And if you're smaller than the 2,000 cases, it's in April. So I wouldn't delay the process. It, just like with anything, it really pays to get the right kind of advice at the beginning. You can do it alone by all means. But it's going to be I guess a longer journey. So think about the cost-benefit analysis, and if you have any questions, you can always come and talk to us. We're always happy to help out people if it's a phone call or whatever. We're not lawyers; we don't charge for phone calls, so feel free to just have a chat if you're a bit sort of lost on the tracks out there. If you didn't have even if you decided you're going to do it on your own.
Perfect.
I think I only have one closing comment, and Roman's highlighted that, but the time is of the essence. Because the timelines are not stipulated by us, there is not much we can do. All we can do is ensure we get our people on ground, conduct the audit, and provide a detailed report. Now, the important thing is, if you want to get that addressed fairly quickly, if you need any help, please raise your hand, let us know. We are here to help, and similar to what Privasec just mentioned, let's get the implementation process sorted, peer reviewed, checked, internal audit completed, whatever it needs to be done. as quickly as you can, because I think that's what we've seen. A lot of providers have delayed, saying, oh, we've got time, and the next thing you know, October 2020 is around the corner. And I similarly, April 2021 would not be that far either. So it's best to try the journey now, rather than leaving it till the last minute.
And Australia being an island, and with COVID, what people like BSI used to do is sometimes to fly in auditors from Southeast Asia, and now obviously that can't happen. So I can only stress to add to that this right fit for risk is a tiny portion of the whole industry that's massively adopting 27001. So the other benefit is the sooner you get started, the sooner you're going to lock in dates with BSI, and that's really key, because time and time again we see people who've done it on their own reach out for help because they just can't meet their contractual or their obligations due to that, because there's only so many auditors that BSI has, and yet it has the largest team of auditors in Australia, right? And even with that, we need to always get in the calendar fairly early.
Fair enough. Guys, thank you very much for taking time out of your calendars and providing your insight. I'm sure it's been great to the audience. And to the audience, thank you for attending. If you have any questions or want to run anything past any of the three panelists, please reach out to us and we'll get them answered for you. But otherwise, I think we can wrap this up. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye-bye. Thanks. Bye. Thanks. Bye.